Given that the FIFA World Cup has previously been hosted by a fascist dictatorship in Italy, a US-backed right-wing military dictatorship in Argentina, and an autocratic Russian regime led by Vladimir Putin, you could be forgiven for thinking that FIFA would never ban anyone or anything from the World Cup, regardless of any past or present indiscretions. Heck, the 2022 World Cup has effectively been built on the backs of modern-day slaves, and if it wasn't for World War II breaking out, the Nazis very well could have won their bid to host the World Cup in 1942, which was ultimately cancelled, having already hosted the Olympics. However, whilst they might not be very consistent, there are actually some red lines that FIFA has. Chile hosting a 1974 World Cup qualifier at a stadium where political prisoners were being detained and murdered without trial was absolutely fine, but the cacharola, a Brazilian percussion instrument, had to be banned in 2014 as organisers considered it to be a security risk. In this video, we're going a bit bigger than individual players like Maradona in 1994 and sex bans like the one that was implemented on the Brazil squad by Luis Felipe Scolari in 2002, though the surprise son that Ronaldo Nazario had in Japan 9 months later perhaps suggests that not everyone followed those instructions to the letter, and focusing only on entire nations and national teams to have been banned from the FIFA World Cup. Rather conveniently, what with this being HITC Sevens and all, there are exactly 7 of them. Here are 7 countries that have been banned from competing at the FIFA World Cup. 7th, Germany and Japan, the 1950 World Cup. It is a double header to get us started, as Germany and Japan come in 6th and 7th, or in joint 7th as I framed it, since they were both banned from the same World Cup. The 1950 World Cup is among the most chaotic FIFA World Cups of all time. World War II had seen the 1942 World Cup cancelled, and by the time that the war ended, FIFA was virtually bankrupt. FIFA's first official post-war meeting in 1946 came too late for a 1946 World Cup to be scheduled, and when FIFA opened up the World Cup bidding process for the rescheduled tournament, which would be held in 1949, no offers to host were forthcoming. FIFA weren't the only ones who were basically bankrupt. At the 11th hour though, Brazil came forward, on the one condition that they could host the tournament in 1950 rather than in 1949, and with no other offers, FIFA had little option but to oblige. Qualification for the tournament was a complete disaster, as 1938 and 1934 finalists, Hungary and Czechoslovakia, refused to compete, along with the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, Peru, Ecuador, and most notably of all, Argentina, all withdrew after the qualifying draw. Even 3 nations who actually did qualify, namely India, Scotland and Turkey, all pulled out, so only 13 teams would actually be present. Also among the absentees were Germany and Japan, in what is widely considered to have been a de facto ban on FIFA's part. The 2 foremost Axis powers during World War II, along with Italy, Germany and Japan were still occupied by the Allies at the time of the 1950 World Cup, and their newly reformed football associations had not yet been readmitted by FIFA. Germany would later be readmitted as 3 separate associations and national teams, East Germany, West Germany, and Saarland. Meanwhile, the Japanese association had actually been barred by FIFA due to a failure to pay their dues in 1945. Italy, on the other hand, were allowed to compete at the 1950 World Cup, since Mussolini's government had been overthrown and their new government sided with the Allies. FIFA actually went to great lengths to ensure that Italy would be present, having been crowned champions, in both 1934 and 38, but just a year after the Superga air disaster wiped out much of their team, the Italians were knocked out during the group stage. 5th, South Africa, 1970, 1974, 1978, 1982, 1986, and 1990 World Cups. No national team has been banned from more FIFA World Cups than South Africa, who were officially banned from competing in 6 separate tournaments and were effectively banned from even more than that. In fairness, If you are going to ban a country from a sporting competition, the fact that their central government and sporting governing bodies enforce a policy of strict racial segregation is probably among the strongest justifications. In 1948, despite winning just 37.7% of the vote, and therefore having actually lost the popular vote, Daniel Francois Marlon was elected as South Africa's new Prime Minister, and his National Party implemented its policy of racial segregation known as apartheid. It's often said and quite widely believed that the sporting boycott of South Africa was a united effort by the civilized nations of the world to pressure South Africa into ending its policy of apartheid. There is some truth to that claim, certainly from the start of the 1970s onwards, but prior to that, it was actually just the case in most sports, including football, that South Africa's policy of racial segregation within the sport itself, not in wider society, was what prohibited them from competing, as it went against the sport's rules. South Africa were disqualified from the 1957 African Cup of Nations for exactly that reason, and from the Confederation of African Football the following year, which was the same year that they joined FIFA. FIFA gave South Africa a year to end their discriminatory sporting policies, which they didn't, so they were suspended. In 1976, having been suspended for the past 12 years, South Africa's all-white FA was expelled from FIFA. Later efforts were made by South Africa to end apartheid solely within sport to end the international boycott, but by that stage, pressure had shifted to pressuring South Africa beyond the four walls of football alone and into ending apartheid for good. In 1992, South Africa held a referendum on apartheid, which, naturally, only white South Africans could vote in which 68.73% of voters voted in favour of ending racial segregation. A multi-racial South African national football team played their first game against Cameroon in 1992, and won. They hosted and won the 1996 African Cup of Nations, and in 2010, South Africa became the first African country, and to date still the only, to host the FIFA World Cup. Fourth, Mexico, the 1990 World Cup. Mexico was the first country to host two FIFA World Cups, and will become the first to have hosted three, albeit jointly in the most recent instance, in 2026. Brazil, Germany, Argentina and Italy are the only countries to have appeared at more World Cups than Mexico, who have qualified 16 times, and reached the quarter-finals on both of the occasions in which they hosted the World Cup in 1970 and 1986. It could well have been 17 though, which would put Mexico level with Argentina, were it not for the fact that the Central Americans were banned from the World Cup finals in Italy in 1990. Just 2 years after Mexico had hosted and reached the quarterfinals of the World Cup, the Mexican Football Federation was involved in a pretty major scandal over the use of 4 overage players in Mexico's under-20 team at the 1988 CONCACAF Under-20 tournament. Initially, Mexico were hit with strict but unsurprising punishments by CONCACAF, as their youth teams were disqualified from several upcoming tournaments and numerous senior officials were handed lifetime bans from the sport. Feeling as though those measures were a bit too strict, Mexico went to FIFA to complain about CONCACAF's measures. But not only did FIFA uphold all of CONCACAF's rulings, they went a couple of steps further, banning Mexico's senior team from all FIFA-sanctioned competitions for the next 2 years, which included Italia 90. Mexico were not the first national team to violate age limits in underage teams, but they were the first to see their senior team punished as a consequence, leaving many Mexican football fans feeling as though an example was being made of them. A week after FIFA banned Mexico from all international football for 2 years, the United States, who had lodged the initial complaint about Mexico's overage players to CONCACAF, were named as 1994 World Cup hosts. The United States took Mexico's place at the FIFA World Youth Championships following Mexico's ban, leading to the conspiracy within Mexico that FIFA banned them to help the United States qualify for Italia 90 and therefore drum up interest and popularity in the sport in America before they hosted the upcoming tournament. Third, Chile, 1994 World Cup. Probably the craziest reason a national team has ever been banned from a World Cup, whilst FIFA was fine with Augusto Pinochet rounding up political prisoners and having them raped, tortured and killed, even at their own stadium during a qualification campaign, they were not okay with one of their players pretending to be injured. Alright, I'm downplaying it a little bit, but if you have never heard of the El Maracanazo scandal before, you'd probably best settle down, strap yourselves in tight, and get ready. There were 3 groups of 3 teams in CONMEBOL qualifying for the 1990 World Cup, each competing for just 2 direct qualification spots for the World Cup and 1 place in an intercontinental playoff. Chile were drawn in Group 3 up against Venezuela and Brazil. Venezuela would be easy prey for both Chile and Brazil, who drew in their first meeting with each other, but Brazil's superior goal difference meant that Chile would have to win the final group game at the Maracanã in order to progress. That would be tough. Brazil were pretty good, but in case things weren't going too well, goalkeeper Roberto Rojas had a plan B. In the 67th minute, with Chile trailing 1-0, he went to ground seemingly having been struck by a flare thrown from someone in the crowd. Rojas' injuries seemed to be pretty severe, he was bleeding heavily, and Chile captain Fernando Estengo led his team off the pitch in protest. Proceeds weren't particularly helped by Chile forward Patricio Yanez grabbing his genitals and mimicking the act of sexual intercourse in front of the Brazil fans en route off the pitch. However, video and photograph evidence in the coming days showed that Rojas hadn't been hit by a flare at all, and under questioning from CONMEBOL, Rojas eventually admitted that he had cut himself using a razor blade that he had hidden inside his gloves, in the hope of getting the game called off and having to be replayed, starting again at 0-0. You know, at a later date. Unsurprisingly, the revelation sent shockwaves through South American and indeed all of world football, and FIFA responded by banning Roberto Rojas for life, captain Fernando Estengo and coach Orlando Aravena for 5 years, and Chile as a national team from the 1994 World Cup. Incidentally, Chile were not actually banned from the 1990 World Cup. Brazil were just awarded with a 2-0 walkover, which saw them qualify ahead of Chile. And again, that was not because of Rojas' cheating, but just because Chile had abandoned the match. Second, Myanmar, 2006 World Cup. Banning Myanmar from the FIFA World Cup is a bit like banning Grimsby Town from the Champions League, or barring Alan Sugar from ever entering Mensa's High IQ Award competition, since Myanmar have never ranked higher than 97th in the FIFA World Rankings as either Burma or since being renamed Myanmar, and they have, rather unsurprisingly, never qualified for the World Cup. They have only ever once qualified for the Asian Cup back in 1968, but they were banned from entering the 2006 World Cup, and therefore they are eligible for this 7. Myanmar is a country which has been plagued by internal conflict since gaining independence from the United Kingdom in 1948, so you might have thought that some kind of escalation in tensions or an increase in violence was responsible for their 2006 World Cup ban. There was an escalation in violence in Myanmar in 2006 when the Tatmadaw, Myanmar's armed forces, launched an offensive against the Karen nationalist group KNLA, which displaced roughly 500,000 people. But that isn't what got Myanmar on the wrong side of FIFA. During 2002 World Cup qualifying, reportedly unhappy at having been drawn in Group 2 up against Iran, Myanmar didn't turn up for their opening game in Tehran and withdrew from the qualifying campaign. FIFA fined Myanmar $23,500 and banned the national team from competing in the 2006 World Cup, in what was a new low for the national team. First, Russia, 2022 World Cup. Interestingly, you will note, almost no country has been banned from competing in a FIFA World Cup directly as a consequence of a conflict. That is to say, that FIFA has said, your government or armed forces have done X, Y, Z, and therefore we have decided that you shouldn't be allowed to compete in the World Cup. In the case of Germany and Japan, it was technically due to them being occupied, their FAs having been disbanded, and not yet having been readmitted to FIFA, and even in the case of South Africa, it was initially sporting discrimination, not apartheid, more broadly, that saw them banned. That is somewhat surprising, given the fact that since the year 2000 alone, there have been at least 16 invasions of foreign countries carried out by various governments, whether that be coalition forces invading Iraq, Kenya invading Somalia, or even Russia themselves invading Georgia in 2008 and then annexing Crimea in the ongoing invasion of Ukraine in 2014. Of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine stepped up a notch earlier this year when Vladimir Putin began what he calls, and what Russians are required by law to call, Russia's special military operation, which has created Europe's largest refugee crisis since World War II, with roughly 5.5 million people having been displaced, and a greatly disputed number of deaths, which numbers at least tens of thousands. In March 2022, less than a week after Russia escalated its invasion of Ukraine, FIFA and UEFA indefinitely suspended all Russian representative teams at both club and international level from their competitions. It came a day after FIFA condemned Russia's use of force in Ukraine and had been criticised for failing to take any further action. And it meant that Russia could not face Poland in their 2022 World Cup qualifier and would therefore be banned from competing in the tournament just 4 years after they had hosted the competition. So why were Russia banned following an invasion, but other countries weren't? Put simply, it is because FIFA and UEFA were left with no other choice. Poland, Sweden, and the Czech Republic all announced on the day of the invasion that they would boycott any fixtures against the Russian national team. And England, Wales, and Scotland soon followed suit, with more countries likely to have joined forces had FIFA and UEFA failed to act. That left the governing bodies with a dilemma. Either they punish national teams for failing to play against Russia, whilst Russia waged a war of aggression in Ukraine, or they suspended Russia. So, however reluctantly, and rather unsurprisingly, they chose to do the latter. That is it for today's video, but thank you all very much, as ever, for watching, and I hope that you enjoyed today's video. If that was the case, why not hit the like button? You can also leave a comment, should you feel so inclined, and make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on, of course, for HITC Sevens. You can also find me, personally, on social media via the username @HITC Sevens on both Twitter and on Instagram. Again, should you wish to do so.